All right, everyone, welcome back to History 101. This week we're looking at the transatlantic trade, and it's going to be like the other lessons where a little bit discussion, or sorry, a little bit lecture, a little bit of discussion, looking at examples from the textbook, which is what we would have done in the classroom. So this one I titled The Middle Passage, and some of you might be familiar with the term. Others might not, but this definitely refers to the transportation of African people to the Americas, and we'll try to highlight some of the things that they went through, and understand that the slave trade was probably one of the most horrific moments in world history, and the impact that it had was definitely universal, and it still impacts us today. And I'm going to address some of those issues in this lecture. So again, that's the importance of history, that these things are still with us, and still shape the way we look at other human beings, unfortunately. So let's begin. First off, let me, like I always say in class, right? Everything starts with the Middle Ages, or everything goes back to the Middle Ages. But I want to start with La Reconquista. If you all remember, that was during the that kind of 700-year period of on again, off again type of war conflict between people in Spain. I don't want to say Muslims against Spaniards, because it wasn't that type of war, but that's the way it's typically presented. But this kind of shapes the mentality of how Europeans begin to see themselves. I noted this with the Crusades, right? It becomes an us versus them. And the La Reconquista definitely adds to that, particularly as they move west into the Americas. So La Reconquista played a very important role, because after 1492, you have all these warriors who have just kind of come out of this 700-year conflict and are still seeking those kind of they still have that kind of war mentality. They still seek land and fortune, and a place that really has no more land to give, in Spain. So you have all this kind of disinherited or just landless people who were part of these conflicts and have nowhere to fight anymore, because Spain has been divvied up amongst the nobility. But many of these men still have that kind of mentality. Imagine living 700 years of war. What does that do to your psyche? So even though we're in 1492, La Reconquista's, I guess, technically over, you still have that kind of medieval mentality of knights, and pushing down the Muslims out of Spain into Africa and wanting some land. So that concept of chivalry and adventure is still there. And as I noted a second ago, the majority of land's already been divided up. Only about 10% of the population controls the territory, which means 90% don't, and they're seeking fortune too. Another thing that's happening at the same time in 1492, give or take, right, during the Renaissance, you have mercantile capitalism developing. Remember that serfdom is on its way out in Europe. People are seeking fortune. The Crusades kind of opened up a lot of economic trade. And the New World offers an opportunity not to discover land or people, but really to make money. At the end of the day, and hopefully you read in the book, that triangular trade system created economic opportunities for many different people. So when you're told that these people were from Europe were coming to the Americas seeking adventure, there's some elements of truth to that, but they were also there to make money. And much of it had to do because these trips were being financed by different groups of people. A person like Columbus was financed by the crown. So yes, we'll let you go explore, and go find yourself over there in the Americas, but at the end of the day, these people who financed the trip expected a return. And one of the best examples that we have is the Spanish crown. They expected a 20% return, which was called a quinto. A quinto means a fifth. So if whatever was discovered or whatever revenue came in, the crown was going to get its fair share of all this. So all these things are working together to kind of create opportunities for many of these Europeans. And remember that the Reconquista and the Crusades did create this concept of us versus them. So at this moment, it's not quite racial, but you begin to see those elements of creating concepts of race around the period of the Renaissance. As I've noted in class, prior to the Renaissance, there was no concept of race, at least not the way we understand it. It's really during the Renaissance where these concepts are created. And as I stated, people have always hated each other for different reasons. During the Middle Ages, it was more religious. By the 1400s, 1500s, you begin to establish this concept of race, and I'll address that as we move forward too. So how does race get constructed? Well, a lot of times historians are maybe not historians, but people get caught up in Columbus, and we kind of put the blame on him, and definitely he helped jumpstart all these kind of conflicts. As the book kind of talks about some of the examples, when he meets the native people of the Americas, for our purposes, we're going to use them as a symbol. He's definitely this kind of before and after situation where he is the starting point where we begin to see the concept of race form. And it's just not denoting skin tone, but it's also addressing this idea that because of your skin tone, you're different. And in this example, you are inferior from Europeans. So during La Reconquista, the Spanish developed this concept called the Cristiano Viejo. The Cristiano Viejo embodies this notion of old Christian who are fighting for what they see as rightfully theirs, which is Spain at this time. And technically, during La Reconquista, nobody owned Spain. And even the term Reconquista is very problematic because it assumes that somebody owned it, somebody came in and took it away, hence the Muslims, and now they're going to get it back. And again, that term is so problematic because nobody owned anything. This is all land that people are conquering left and right. So in that process, 700-year process, Spanish people begin to develop this concept of we are the landowners of this place, and we're going to take it back because our ancestors have been fighting for it for 700 years. Hence the concept of Cristiano Viejo, which means old Christian, right? Other people have fought for it. We're just continuing that legacy. In addition, as Spain was going through La Reconquista, you have women, you have families who are moving into these new conquered territories, and they develop these different identities. La Mujer Villana means basically a village woman. As they're taking over land, the women kind of stay behind, take care of the homestead, if you will, as their husbands, the Caballero Villano, their husbands, go into this frontier and, again, push the Muslims back. So it's a woman's responsibility to take care of their household while her husband fights the, from their perspective, the infidels, right, the Muslim people. Now, this will become important when I talk about gender and race formation and the way it impacts colored bodies in the 1500s. So as La Reconquista begins to take off, you begin to see this formation of race. There's no one day where this concept was created. It's more of a process. But it's created to limit certain human bodies from benefiting from a system that was established for one particular group. So this hierarchy, which we probably know fairly well, is kind of created in this era. And you see it in the terminology that they begin to use, and I'll give you some examples, particularly when they conquer Mexico, using words like moriscos and mestizos and so forth. It creates this system where skin tone defines your status in society. Now understand too that it's not just kind of addressing different body types, but it's also tied to capitalism. As the book kind of noted, that different bodies did different labor in the Americas. So as this concept of race is being developed, it's also being tied to different human bodies. And in the Americas, we begin to see the importation of African peoples in Mexico, Caribbean, Brazil, to do most of the labor. And it's a horrific history of what happens to these people, but understand that people were making money off this. So capitalism didn't create racism, but it definitely didn't help it either. It all kind of snowballed, and they both kind of worked hand in hand. And again, it's not an evil plan, it's just that people were trying to make money off other human beings. I'm going to stop it there, and I want you to look at two particular readings and just kind of address what you read, and look at how this concept of race is kind of being shaped. All right, so this is from your book, and you'll answer a few questions.